Along the mist-covered coastline of Massachusetts, where the sharp Atlantic winds carry whispers of old sins, stands a weathered stone marker that few dare to approach. Local fishermen quietly cross themselves when they pass by, and even the bravest historians avoid speaking openly about what it truly remembers. The marker carries nothing but a date, 1687, and two names that once filled every God-fearing colonist with dread: Ezekiel and Judith Harrington. For nearly 20 years, these siblings built an empire of blood and suspicion, growing rich from the cries of the innocent and the seizure of their homes and land. But when their forbidden union produced twin children so horribly deformed that even the most hardened doctors ran in terror, people began to whisper that divine punishment had finally reached them. What really happened in that lonely manor house, where 8-year-old children with broken bodies but sharp, cunning minds plotted against their own parents, remained buried under layers of fear and superstition. Until now. Before we continue with the story of the Harrington family and their dreadful legacy, I want you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because tales like this, tales that most would prefer erased, are exactly what we uncover here. Also, tell me in the comments what state or city you're watching from, since these dark histories reach into every corner of America. The truth about the Harrington wealth and its cursed heirs shows a level of planned cruelty that would make even the hardest observer question what human beings are capable of when greed outweighs conscience. The Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1660s lived in a constant mix of religious passion and economic struggle. Small coastal settlements like Wickham's Harbor, a village of barely 300 people set between cliffs and pine forests, survived on fishing, farming, and an uneasy balance with the deep-rooted supernatural beliefs guiding daily colonial life. Puritan teaching demanded constant watchfulness against Satan's tricks, and in such isolated places, suspicion spread faster than fire through dry fields. Ezekiel Harrington, only 28, carried sharp features and piercing gray eyes that would later symbolize judgment and accusation. His younger sister Judith, 25, was equally striking with her severe beauty, sharing the same firm jaw and icy expression. But where Ezekiel drew attention through his strong presence, Judith controlled through whispers and carefully placed doubts. Both had been given more education than most of their neighbors. Their father, a failed Boston trader, insisted they learn to read, write, and most importantly, to understand the fine points of property law and inheritance rights. When their parents died of fever in 1663, leaving little more than a plain farmhouse and rising debts, the siblings faced the same bleak future as countless other colonists. But unlike neighbors who turned to farming, trade, or service, Ezekiel and Judith saw opportunity in the spreading panic about witchcraft. Across New England, communities had started hiring witch-finders, people who claimed special powers for detecting Satan's servants. These figures could earn large fees for their work, and even better, they often received shares of the accused person's property, once confiscated. The siblings' first assignment came in Milford, 2 days inland, where dead livestock and failed crops had stirred fear. Ezekiel posed as a learned expert in witchcraft science, while Judith acted as his assistant, skilled in spotting hidden marks on the accused. Their method was cold but simple. They would arrive in a troubled town, study its wealth and social tensions, then accuse those whose property would bring the greatest gain once taken. Their first target was the widow Constance Fletcher, whose late husband had left her a valuable grain mill that several men in the community already wanted. With careful planning, the Harringtons orchestrated her downfall. She was accused of cursing the harvest through wicked rituals. The evidence appeared crushing. Mysterious marks on her body secretly inflicted by Judith during a forced examination. Testimonies from neighbors coached by Judith's whispers, and the suspicious fact that her mill kept producing flour when others failed, though this was only due to her better upkeep and location. Constance Fletcher was hanged on November 15, 1664. Her mill was divided between the village and the Harrington siblings as their reward. Few, But this was only the beginning of a bloody enterprise that would stretch across 8 communities and claim the lives of 57 innocent people over the next 15 years. The decision for Ezekiel and Judith to marry did not come from love. Such unions between siblings were technically possible under certain colonial laws if there were pressing reasons, but their choice was purely practical. By 1675, the pair controlled assets worth more than £15,000, an enormous fortune for the time. They owned land in 9 towns, held mortgages on countless farms and shops, and kept secret records of their crimes covering more than a decade. But one problem remained: inheritance and protection. If either married an outsider, that spouse would gain rights to the fortune and possibly uncover their crimes. If either died without heirs, complicated laws might give their wealth to distant relatives or even the colonial authorities. Their answer was ruthless and pragmatic, like everything they did. Ezekiel, being older, married Judith in a private ceremony performed by a corrupt minister they had bribed during a Salem witch trial. The marriage was hidden from the world, presented publicly as a business partnership between a confirmed bachelor and an unmarried woman who had devoted themselves to God's service in rooting out witches. The ceremony took place on December 21st, 1675 during the winter solstice, chosen for its symbolic weight rather than any mystical belief. It happened in their manor's cellar, witnessed only by the minister and 2 servants forced into silence. The vows mocked Christian tradition, serving not as an act of love or devotion, but as a legal shield to guard their riches and secrets. When Judith became pregnant in early 1676, it seemed to confirm the success of their dark arrangement. The pregnancy went smoothly at first, with no signs of trouble. They hired Sarah Wheatham, a respected midwife from Boston, paying her an impressive sum to live at the manor and oversee Judith's health. They ordered rich foods, rare medicines, and even had twin cradles carved from the finest mahogany, lined with silk bedding, meant for heirs of great fortune. But as the final months approached, subtle signs showed that something was wrong. In the 7th month, Judith began feeling movements the midwife described as disturbingly violent. Sarah Wheatham, who had delivered more than 300 children, said she had never felt anything like it. Instead of normal kicks and rolls, these were like 2 beings fighting inside the womb. It feels as though they're battling one another. Sarah whispered to her helper, Emma Prescott, a young woman from Boston brought in for what was expected to be a routine, though secret, delivery. I've delivered twins before, many times. But never have I felt such fierce motion. It's almost as if they want to hurt each other. Ezekiel dismissed her concerns as foolish superstition from an old woman, but in private, he began to worry. They had invested too much in this pregnancy to accept failure. Ezekiel threw himself into frantic research, searching for any explanation or remedy for what might come. He collected every medical book he could find in the colonies, exchanged letters with doctors in London and Edinburgh, and even met with several midwives from distant areas to learn about unusual births and strange developments. What his study revealed was at once comforting and unsettling. Many texts confirmed that twin pregnancies often brought stronger and more violent movements in the womb compared to single births, as the babies struggled for limited space and nourishment. Yet several sources also mentioned dangers linked to what they called close blood relations between parents, which included a higher chance of stillbirth, birth defects, and mental weakness in surviving children. The birth, when it finally came on March 15, 1677, dragged on for nearly 2 days and involved complications that would mark Sarah Whitcomb for the rest of her life. The twins who emerged were instantly seen as terribly deformed, with limbs bent at unnatural angles, skulls marked by strange bony growths, and bodies partly joined by fleshy bridges that seemed to connect their chests and perhaps their inner organs. What stunned the men present most of all was not simply the grotesque appearance, but the clear signs of awareness shown by the newborns. They moved with intention, reached out for objects placed nearby, and exchanged sounds and motions that seemed to form a language neither midwife could make sense of. Despite their shocking bodies, The children displayed a sharpness that was both extraordinary and deeply troubling. Ezekiel and Judith named the boys Gabriel and Raphael, choosing biblical names in hopes of shielding them from whispers of dark influence. Against all expectations, the children survived their brutal entry into the world and began to grow in ways no one could have predicted. By their first birthday, it became clear that, although their bodies remained twisted and weak, their minds advanced at an incredible pace. The years from 1677 to 1685 marked both the height of the Harringtons' influence and the arrival of their gravest trial. As Gabriel and Raphael grew from infants into children, the mix of severe disability and shocking intelligence created difficulties that went far beyond ordinary care. Their odd shared comatome required constant watchfulness and special attention, straining their parents' ability to maintain their public image and their criminal ventures. By their 8th birthday in March 1685, the boys had become something unheard of in colonial Massachusetts, crippled children with minds as sharp as trained scholars. Though they could not walk properly or play as other children did, they had already taught themselves to read by the age of 4, mastered arithmetic by 5, and by 7 were engaged in debates on philosophy that would challenge university students. More troubling than their skills was the fact that they were beginning to understand their parents' true nature. The twins had been hidden away in the manor all their lives, said to be sheltered from cruel gossip and fears of the supernatural. But in truth they were kept secret, so no one would connect their twisted forms to divine punishment for their parents' sins. This seclusion, however, allowed them full access to private talks, financial records, and planning sessions for their parents' criminal dealings. They learned to remain silent and perfectly still when adults came near, tricking Ezekiel and Judith into speaking openly in their presence, thinking the boys were too young or too crippled to understand. This grave miscalculation would become the family's undoing. By 1685, the twins had gathered detailed knowledge of the Harrington witch hunting operations. They knew of the false evidence, the bribed witnesses, and the cold-blooded murders of innocents for wealth. Even worse for their parents, the boys had figured out that their own broken bodies were not a punishment from God nor a stroke of fate, but the direct result of their parents' choice to marry within their bloodline to safeguard their fortune. This realization filled the twins with anger, grief, and a fierce will to seek justice. Dependent as they were on their parents' care, they nonetheless began planning to reveal the truth and avenge the victims. Their first chance came in the summer of 1685, when a young woman named Margaret Caldwell came to the manor looking for work. Margaret was the daughter of Thomas Caldwell, a blacksmith falsely accused and executed for witchcraft in 1679, so that the Harringtons could seize his forge and valuable property in Hadley's Crossing. Margaret did not know who had been behind her father's downfall. She only knew that the Harringtons were wealthy and respected and might employ her. What she would uncover inside their household, however, would spark one of the greatest scandals of the colonial witch trials. The way the twins reached out to Margaret was both clever and heartbreaking. Though they struggled to speak and were limited in movement, they managed to leave small written notes in places she would find while cleaning. At first the messages contained simple hints about hidden papers and suspicious accounts, but soon they grew into precise instructions pointing her toward evidence of the Harringtons' crimes. Even more, Gabriel and Raphael learned to tell which of their parents' guests were dangerous, and they warned Margaret in advance when particularly violent allies were expected at the manor. They had seen enough of the secret dealings to know some of these men were even crueler than their parents, and they used their knowledge of appointments and schedules to keep Margaret out of harm's way. The turning point arrived in September 1685, when the twins directed Margaret to a false wall in Ezekiel's study that concealed the most damning evidence ledgers, recording 15 years of fraud and bloodshed. The books listed bribes, witness payments, property values of confiscated lands, and expenses for fabricated trials, all written proof of a vast machine built on lies and murder. Margaret now held undeniable evidence of guilt, but also carried the risk of discovery. She knew if Ezekiel or Judith learned of her knowledge, they would silence her as they had so many others. Her survival, and that of the twins, depended on a plan. Instead of running with the papers or confronting the siblings, Margaret chose a bolder path. She secretly copied the worst documents, and at the same time reached out to Father Benedict Thorne, a Jesuit priest newly arrived in Boston from France. Thorne not only had the theological training to grasp the spiritual weight of the matter, but also possessed political ties, strong enough to investigate powerful figures. At first, Father Como doubted Margaret's claims, but once he began studying the copies and looking deeper into the Harringtons' dealings, his disbelief gave way to horror. One piece of evidence led to another, each confirming that the network of corruption and bloodshed had thrived under the guise of piety for more than 20 years. Margaret Caldwell's first move toward the priest had been careful and indirect, as she knew that open accusations against such powerful and respected people would almost certainly bring about her own ruin, through the same methods they had already used on others. Yet the evidence Margaret slowly shared with Father Thorne, copies of money records, lists of witnesses with notes about payments and threats, and worst of all, detailed mapping where seized properties were located and who now owned them, created a picture of organized crime that went beyond even the darkest expectations the priest had about human greed and cruelty. Father Thorne's knowledge of both religion and natural philosophy gave him the rare ability to fully understand the weight of what Margaret had uncovered. Unlike colonial officials who might brush off accusations of dark practices as beyond their reach, or doctors who might only pay attention to the physical condition of the children, the priest carried both the wisdom and the authority to look into not just the crimes, but also the moral decay behind the Harrington case. His choice to visit the manor in October 1685 was presented to the family as nothing more than a normal pastoral call, the new priest wishing to meet leading members of the community and offer guidance to a household touched by the sadness of troubled births. Ezekiel and Judith, sure of their skill in bending religious leaders to their will, welcomed the visit, seeing it as another chance to strengthen their image in the colony while also learning about any possible threats to their secrets. What they could not predict, however, was Father Thorne's sharp training in uncovering lies and his deep ability to notice the mental and spiritual damage caused by a lifetime of evil acts. Within only minutes of stepping into the manor, the priest sensed a heaviness in the air that revealed deep spiritual rot. It was not the touch of demons, but rather the lingering shadow left behind by years of carefully planned killings and moral corruption. When Father Thorne asked to meet the children, it seemed to be nothing more than concern for young souls struggling with physical burdens. In truth, his aim was to see whether Gabriel and Raphael had the sharpness and awareness to one day testify against their parents. Margaret's writings had hinted that the twins grasped far more of their situation than Ezekiel and Judith imagined. But the priest needed to test this with his own eyes and ears before risking their safety by drawing them into his mission. When Father Thorne finally entered the children's rooms, the reality surpassed even Margaret's detailed notes in both sadness and possibility. Gabriel and Raphael, though burdened with severe physical deformities and constant pain, displayed a mind and maturity that would have been remarkable in any child, let alone ones who had lived cut off from ordinary human contact. More striking still, they showed no fear at the sight of the priest despite never meeting him before. Instead, their faces carried relief, even hope, as though they had long been waiting for someone strong enough to confront their parents. Almost at once, they began trying to share with him what they had seen: crimes committed, secrets hidden, and evidence destroyed. Father Thorne's religious education had prepared him to comfort victims of terrible cruelty, and he recognized in these children the same mix of suffering, clear knowledge, and desperate hope he had once seen in survivors of torture and persecution. Yet this case was different, for Gabriel and Raphael were not adults who could speak for themselves. They were trapped by weak bodies and completely reliant on the very people who had both created their condition and caused their misery. The priest's departure from the manor looked polite on the surface, but everyone present knew that a true conflict had begun. Father Thorn had confirmed his darkest fears about the children and their parents, while Ezekiel and Judith had spotted in his words and looks a dangerous level of awareness and resolve that threatened their carefully built life of lies. Back in Boston, Father Thorn began an investigation that was patient-wide, reaching, and backed by the full machinery of the Catholic Church's networks. Unlike the rough justice of colonial courts, the Church possessed skilled systems for gathering facts, studying witness accounts, and building airtight cases against the mighty who thought themselves untouchable. Within only 3 weeks, the priest had collected a full file on the Harringtons' deeds. It contained financial papers demanded from colonial banks, statements from surviving kin of those they had ruined, and the most damning piece of all, a confession from Marcus Fletcher, a one-time helper who had planted false proof and trained witnesses in several witch trials in return for payment and safety from his own punishments. Fletcher's testimony uncovered the wide span of the Harringtons' crimes. He described how they picked out their victims, set up false evidence, and worked hand in hand with crooked officials to guarantee trial results in their favor. But worse still, Fletcher admitting knowledge of the siblings' choice to marry each other and their spoken plans to use their children's condition for private shows before wealthy guests curious about rare medical cases. This added a new depth of horror to the already grim story. Not only had Ezekiel and Judith sent innocent people to their deaths for wealth, but they had also brought children into the world through incest, only to exploit their suffering for further gain. Father Thorn's strongest tool, however, turned out to be the children themselves. Gabriel and Raphael, though young and frail, carried sharp memories of conversations and events that matched the proof found in their parents' records. Their clear intelligence and sense of right and wrong made them powerful witnesses, voices no one could dismiss as confused or delusional. Through carefully arranged secret visits, Margaret Cardwell helped the priest speak with them. And what the twins revealed exposed not just neglect, but years of cruel experiments. Ezekiel and Judith had kept their children hidden not only to protect their own names, but also to use them as subjects for twisted trials. The twins described endless painful procedures, done without medicine, being pushed to solve hard problems under the threat of hunger, and being turned into tools for their parents, sick ideas about how body deformities linked to mind power. Worst of all, the children told him their parents had been recording every detail of their growth and behavior, planning to sell these records to doctors in Europe who studied the effects of blood relatives producing offspring. As 1685 neared its end, pressure inside Harrington Manor rose sharply. Father Thorn now held undeniable evidence of their guilt, yet he faced the dangerous task of exposing such ruthless people without sparking a violent retaliation that could harm the children or other witnesses. At the same time, Gabriel and Raphael had become bolder in their quiet fight against their parents, making use of their position as harmless invalids. They observed and noted things even Margaret could not safely see. They developed clever ways of recording what they learned despite their physical struggles, hiding small stashes of notes that described both ongoing crimes and their parents' next schemes. Their courage did not pass unnoticed. Ezekiel and Judith began to sense that their children were far more aware and capable than they had once believed. Ezekiel and Judith's reaction to this suspicion showed the complete lack of natural parental love that had marked their relationship with the twins since birth. Instead of feeling pride in their children's sharpness or concern for their safety, the siblings saw Gabriel and Raphael's growing independence as a possible danger to their control. The crisis that would finally bring their entire secret empire crashing down started in early December 1685, when Ezekiel found signs that someone had been looking through his hidden financial records. Scratch marks on the false panels, loose hinges, and disturbed dust on the papers revealed repeated secret entry into his most guarded files. Even more troubling was the fact that whoever had gained entry had enough skill to notice the most dangerous documents. Pages that contained clear references to bribery, witness threats, and property schemes had been marked with tiny pencil dots, invisible to a casual glance, but proof of serious study. Ezekiel's first suspicion fell on Margaret Caldwell, whose role as household servant gave her both chance and reason to spy on them. But when he and Judith put Margaret through harsh questioning, using methods they had perfected during their witch hunting years, they realized that though she knew many of their crimes, she could not have been behind every security breach they had found. The truth, that their own children had been quietly collecting evidence against them for months, was so far outside their way of thinking that they did not even consider it at first. They were too used to seeing Gabriel and Raphael as weak dependents whose physical struggles made them harmless, and they could not imagine the twins as active threats. This blindness to their children's abilities became a fatal mistake that would eventually destroy everything they had built. While Ezekiel and Judith looked for enemies outside, focusing their suspicion on Margaret Caldwell and Father Thorne, Gabriel and Raphael kept advancing their secret work with greater skill and courage. The twins had invented clever ways to share information and plan together, even though they were often separated during daily routines. They used written notes, small coded sounds, and even the movement of objects around the house to pass messages. The very physical struggles their parents thought made them weak had instead forced the children to sharpen their minds, their memory, and their powers of watching people, far beyond what most children their age could manage. By mid-December 1685, Gabriel and Raphael had gathered evidence not only of past crimes, but also of their parents' upcoming plans. They learned that Ezekiel and Judith intended to expand their operations into the Connecticut River Valley, where recent Indian attacks had stirred fear and suspicion. The siblings saw this as the perfect chance to make money by accusing people of working with supernatural forces. Even more alarming was the discovery that their parents had also started planning their deaths. Gabriel and Raphael overheard talk about tragic accidents that could happen to disabled children during the freezing winter, and they saw their parents making ready in ways that suggested they would not live to see spring. The children's answer to this deadly threat showed both their sharp intelligence and their deep understanding of their parents' twisted minds. Rather than running away or only warning Father Thorne, Gabriel and Raphael chose to push forward their secret gathering of evidence while also preparing for one final move that would expose everything. Their plan was both simple and terrifying in how well it matched their parents' own cruel methods. They decided to create a situation that would force Ezekiel and Judith to show their true selves in front of people who held enough power and trust to make sure justice would be done. The twins knew their weak bodies made it impossible to fight their parents directly, but they were willing to risk their lives if their sacrifice could bring down the empire that had taken so many innocent lives. The moment they had been waiting for came on December 21st, 1685, the 10th anniversary of their parents' secret wedding. This date was always marked with private celebrations in which Ezekiel and Judith let down their guard and showed their real faces more than at any other time. For Gabriel and Raphael, it was the perfect setting for their final strike. The plan required perfect timing, total courage, and a calmness of mind that would have been impressive in grown adults, let alone children who had never known freedom beyond the walls of their home. But Gabriel and Raphael understood that they had something their parents never expected: the clear sense of right and wrong that comes from suffering great wrongs, and the cleverness to turn that clarity into action. The events of December 21, 1685 unfolded with a sharpness that showed the months of careful planning by two children only 8 years old, who had never played as normal children, but instead were forced to become patient strategists. Their success depended on their deep knowledge of their parents' habits, moods, and schemes, along with their special role as witnesses their parents had always ignored. The twins made sure Father Thorn would arrive at the manor that evening, just as their parents began their yearly ritual. This ritual included counting their stolen wealth, reading out notes of their victims, and plotting future moves. Though Ezekiel and Judith believed it was completely secret, it always took place in a room directly above the children's chambers, and Gabriel and Raphael had listened to these dark recitations year after year. The air in Harrington Manor that December night felt thick with dread as Ezekiel and Judith prepared for their 10th anniversary celebration. They had spent the day reviewing their records and setting aside plans for what they intended to be their last winter in Massachusetts. They were preparing to move south to the Carolina colonies, where they hoped to continue their schemes with new names and without the weight of their reputation. They had already begun selling off some property in New England and were laying the groundwork for this fresh start. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Raphael, locked in their chambers as usual, had been getting ready for this night for weeks, planning every detail with the skill of hardened plotters. Despite their limited bodies, they had built hidden stores of evidence around the manor, copies of dangerous documents, maps of stolen lands, and written accounts of crimes they had seen or overheard. Even more daringly, they had spent months slowly weakening parts of the manor itself, using simple tools and knowledge taken from their parents' library of architectural books. Their plan demanded an exact knowledge of how the building stood, and they taught themselves enough of design and weight to prepare a trap. What might have seemed impossible for adults, they had mastered out of pure need and determination to escape. Father Thorn's arrival at the manor was not sudden. He had been quietly studying the place for weeks, learning its layout, marking escape paths, and creating secret signals with the children through flashes of light seen from their windows. On that night, everything was ready. The priestess passed in the military, having once served as a chaplain during violent European wars before joining the church, had given him tactical skills that proved priceless in planning what was really a rescue mission, disguised as a simple pastoral visit. The officials who went along with Father Thorn were not only colonial officers holding warrants, but also doctors ready to check and care for the Harrington children, legal clerks prepared to record evidence, and even an engineer whose knowledge would be required to remove victims safely from what everyone knew could turn into a dangerous clash. This careful level of preparation showed the priest's awareness that they would only have one chance to uncover the Harrington crimes before the siblings either fled or destroyed all proof and silenced every witness. When Father Thorn knocked on the manor's main door at exactly 700 that evening, Ezekiel and Judith were in the middle of their yearly anniversary ritual, surrounded by proof that would make denial pointless, even if they had been inclined toward honesty. The brother and sister's first reaction to the unexpected visit was one of irritated confidence. They had pushed away official investigations for over 2 decades and assumed this night would be no different. But as Father Thorn explained his supposed purpose, concern for Margaret Caldwell's health and his wish to offer spiritual comfort to the family during the harsh winter months, both Ezekiel and Judith started to feel that something about this visitor was not ordinary. The priest's tone was too firm, his questions too direct, and his awareness of their household details far too exact for just a routine pastoral call. Como Yuma Ordem Fria, the moment of truth, arrived when Father Thorn asked for permission to see Gabriel and Raphael, pretending he wanted to pray for their continued strength and peace. The siblings' first thought was to deny this request, using their usual excuses about the children's delicate state and their vulnerability to any excitement. But they quickly realized that such refusal might itself appear suspicious to someone who was clearly paying more attention than past visitors. Their choice to let Father Thorn enter the children's chambers was the fatal mistake that would ruin everything they had built across more than 20 years of murder and theft. When the priest walked into the twins' room, with Ezekiel and Judith following close behind, to watch the conversation, he immediately used the signal system he and the children had set up earlier. Gabriel and Raphael's reaction was instant and overwhelming. Even with their parents standing right there, the twins began to recite in detail crimes they had witnessed, naming victims, providing dates, and pointing out where physical evidence could be found. Though their voices were uneven because of their frail health, the clarity and exactness of their words made their testimony impossible to deny. On the night of September 14, 1679, Gabriel began carefully, forcing his weak body to pronounce each word. Our father and mother met Marcus Fletcher in the cellar to prepare the accusation against Thomas Caldwell. Mother gave Fletcher silver coins, taken from Rebecca Whitmore's stolen jewelry, and father gave him full instructions on where to place the puppet that would be discovered in Caldwell's barn. Raphael continued smoothly without missing a beat, showing how prepared they were. The puppet carried a hair cut from Caldwell's youngest daughter during a forced medical check our parents had done under the excuse of searching for witch marks. Fletcher was told to hide the puppet beneath the anvil in Caldwell's forge, where witnesses, already instructed where to search, would find it. The shock of hearing their most closely kept secrets repeated by their own children in front of a priest who clearly held the power to act tore apart Ezekiel and Judith's calmness. For the first time in their criminal lives, they faced a danger they had never imagined, betrayal from the very victims they had always believed were weak and powerless. But the twins were not finished. Gabriel and Raphael had committed to memory not only their parents' past evil acts, but also their ongoing activities and even plans for the future. They spoke of hidden collections of stolen valuables, described the bribery systems that had protected their parents from questioning, and worst of all, revealed murders so carefully hidden that the authorities had never even guessed they occurred. In the chest below the study's eastern floorboards, Raphael continued, his voice stronger now that he believed rescue was truly coming. There are 37 pieces of jewelry taken from women wrongfully executed, including the wedding ring of Mary Hutchkins, who was hanged in 1681 after our father accused her of cursing his cattle. Gabriel carried the story forward without pause. Mary Hutchkins was innocent. Father killed her cow with poison he secretly bought from a merchant in Boston. Then he declared the death proof of witchcraft. Mary's land, 12 acres of good farmland, and her husband's blacksmith tools were seized, shared between the town and our parents as reward for exposing a soul called witch. The twins' exact words, their obvious intelligence, and their frail but undeniable physical state formed a case so strong that no fair observer could explain it away. Father Thorne had not only brought the official right to investigate the Harringtons, but also witnesses whose honesty could not be doubted, along with clerks who carefully preserved every detail of the children's testimony. Ezekiel and Judith's reaction to this crushing exposure showed the complete lack of natural human feelings that had always defined their lives. Instead of sorrow, fear, or care for their children's lives, they instantly began calculating how to silence witnesses and escape punishment. Their first desperate tactic was to claim Gabriel and Raphael suffered delusions caused by their weak condition. But this lie collapsed quickly when Father Thorne produced supporting records and other testimony that confirmed each detail the twins had given. When denial became impossible and their empire of fear was clearly about to collapse, Ezekiel and Judith put into motion the emergency escape plan they had prepared for such a moment. Hidden all over the manor were weapons, secret routes, and stored funds meant to let them kill anyone in their way and run to lands beyond colonial authority. What followed was fierce and bloody, but exactly as Gabriel and Raphael had expected. For months the twins had studied their parents' hidden escape systems and had designed counters to them, ensuring the rescuer's safety and blocking every chance of escape. When Ezekiel pulled a hidden pistol and aimed at Father Thorne, the weapon misfired and exploded. The firing parts had been subtly damaged, with small bits of metal. Gabriel had placed in the barrel over many weeks. The explosion crippled Ezekiel's hand and ended his ability to fight. Judith tried to stab a colonial officer with a concealed knife, but she triggered one of the booby traps Raphael had prepared by loosening boards in chosen spots. She fell hard, badly hurt, and in falling also set off a system of mechanical devices the twins had rigged to lock doors and windows, cutting off every exit. The last battle unfolded in the manor's main hall, where Gabriel and Raphael's careful structural adjustments were finally put to use. The children had weakened parts of the building, so they would collapse when needed, while leaving safe paths for rescuers. When Ezekiel and Judith realized their paths out were blocked and their weapons ruined, they made one last frantic attempt to kill their children. But Gabriel and Raphael, expecting this final move, had already set their strongest defenses in place.